Hey everyone, I'm here to help you relax and drift off tonight. If you enjoy using these videos to fall asleep, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more calming content. Share where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I'd love to know. Now settle into a cozy spot, take a deep breath, and let's start unwinding together. No matter which path you take, you'll always end up at the same place. That was the only warning Henry Whitaker received before entering Black Hollow Forest. A faded mapmaker's note, scrawled in trembling ink, left behind in a dusty old travel journal he found in the attic. Most would have dismissed it as folklore, a ghost story told to scare children away from wandering too deep into the woods. But Henry wasn't like most people. He was a cartographer, an explorer of landscapes, a collector of forgotten places. And if the legend of Black Hollow was true, then it was something worth discovering. So he packed his bag, strapped on his boots, and stepped into the forest. The first trail Henry chose was a narrow dirt path, winding between towering black pine trees. The air was damp, heavy with the scent of moss and earth. His boots crunched against fallen leaves as he walked, carefully sketching the map as he went. He kept precise track of his direction, a straight line, northward. He walked for nearly an hour, watching the forest shift around him, the trees closing in tighter, the sunlight dimming. Then suddenly, he stepped into a clearing, a circular glade surrounded by gnarled oak trees, their branches twisted like reaching fingers. And in the center, a stone well. It was old, covered in vines, the stones worn smooth by time. Henry frowned. He hadn't marked this clearing on his map. Had he made a wrong turn? He checked his compass. The needle spun wildly, refusing to settle. His frown deepened. With a sigh, he turned back and chose a different path. This time he turned westward. The path was wider, edged by thick ferns and strange blue flowers that glowed faintly in the dimming light. He walked faster, making sure to keep track of every step. No wrong turns, no mistakes. But after another hour, he stepped into a clearing, the same twisted oaks, the same stone well. Henry's stomach twisted. This wasn't possible. He had walked in a completely different direction, and yet he was back at the same place. A trick of the forest, a loop, or something worse? Taking a deep breath, he chose another path. He walked east, then south, then west again. Each time he followed a new trail. Each time he mapped his every step. And each time, the clearing waited for him. By the time he arrived for the fifth time, his hands were shaking. He checked his watch. The hands had stopped moving. The forest was playing with him. His breath came in sharp bursts. This wasn't just a trick of the mind. Something was wrong with this place. Desperation clawed at Henry's throat. There had to be a way out. His eyes drifted to the well, the only thing in this clearing he had yet to touch. Slowly, he approached. The closer he got, the colder the air became. His breath fogged in front of him. With trembling hands, he peered over the edge. The darkness inside was endless, a void that swallowed all light. Then, a voice, software echoing from the depths. "You are lost!" Henry stumbled back. His heart thundered. The voice was his own. Henry ran without a path, through the underbrush, through the darkness. Tree branches whipped at his face, tearing his clothes, but he didn't care. He just needed to get away. Then, his foot snagged on something. He crashed to the ground, rolling onto his back with a groan. When he looked up, he wasn't alone. Figures stood in the shadows between the trees, pale, still, watching him. Dozens of them. Some wore clothes from another century, tattered dresses, ragged coats. Others were barefoot, their faces hollow with hunger. All of them lost, trapped, like him. Henry's breaths were shallow. He scrambled to his feet, his back to the well. The figures didn't move closer, didn't speak. They just watched. Then the whisper came again. "You are lost." And this time he understood. They had all made the same mistake. They had all walked into Black Hollow Forest thinking they could leave. But there was only one way out. His eyes drifted to the well, the deep, endless darkness below. The whisper rose, a chorus now. "Jump!" Henry's mind screamed no. But his body moved forward, his legs trembled, his hands gripped the cold stone edge. The whisper turned to a chant. "Jump! Jump! Jump!" His heartbeat slowed. The forest held its breath. And Henry, he let go. Falling, falling, forever. Days passed, weeks, months. The forest remained silent. Until a new traveler arrived. She stepped carefully through the trees, her boots crunching against fallen leaves. A cartographer, just like Henry had been. And ahead of her, the first clearing, a stone well, waiting, and from below, a whisper. "You are lost." There was an old legend in the town of Elder's Hollow, a story whispered by candlelight, shared only in hushed voices. It spoke of a candle unlike any other, a candle that never melted, its wax untouched by time, a candle that burned without fire, yet flickered in the darkness. And most chillingly, a candle that only flickered when spirits were near. Few believed in such superstitions, dismissing it as an old wives' tale. But one man, Edwin Thorne, knew the story was true, because he had seen the candle flicker before, and he had sworn to never light it again. Edwin inherited the candle from his grandfather, Elias Thorne, a renowned candlemaker who lived and died in Elder's Hollow. His workshop, filled with the scent of beeswax and lavender, had been the heart of the town for nearly a century. But Elias had one candle he never sold. It sat on the highest shelf, tucked away in a glass case, its wax as black as night, its wick untouched. "This one is not for the living," Elias had once warned. "It is meant only for those who have passed." Edwin had thought it was just folklore, a story to keep children from playing with fire. But after his grandfather died, Edwin took over the shop. And one stormy night, in a moment of curiosity, he lit the candle. The moment the match touched the wick, a flame burst to life. But it was not orange or yellow like a normal flame. It was blue, a cold, unnatural light that cast long shadows against the walls. At first, Edwin thought it was a trick of the wax, something strange in the formula. Then, the flame flickered, not with the wind, not from a draft, but as if something unseen had moved past it. The air around him grew heavy, thick with a presence he could not explain. Then, a whisper, software echoing from the darkness. "You shouldn't have lit the candle." Edwin spun around, but he was alone, or so he thought. Edwin tried to put out the flame, but no matter how hard he blew, the flame would not die. He poured water over it, yet the flame burned on. He even tried snuffing it with his fingers, and the flame turned black, but it did not go out. The whispers grew louder. "You called us. You lit the way. Now we are here." Shadows shifted at the edge of the candlelight. Figures began to take form. Pale faces, hollow eyes lingering just beyond his reach. They were everywhere. Spirits, dozens of them, and all of them were watching him. Edwin's heart hammered in his chest. These weren't just random spirits. They were people he knew. His grandfather, Elias Thorne. His mother, who had died when he was a child. Even people from the town, those who had passed long ago, their faces still frozen in time. They weren't haunting him. They were waiting. But waiting for what? Then he understood. The candle was never meant to be feared. It was meant to be used. a beacon for the dead, a way for them to speak once more. The spirits whispered their secrets, stories they had never told in life, regrets they had left unfinished, a murder hidden beneath Elder's Hollow, a stolen fortune buried beneath the old church, a promise unfulfilled for decades. One by one, Edwin listened. One by one, he wrote them down. And with every story told, the candle's flame dimmed. By the time the last spirit spoke its final words, the candle flickered one last time. And then it went out. The spirits were gone. The air was lighter, and Edwin was alone again. Edwin locked the black candle back in its glass case. It had served its purpose, and he would not light it again. But one day, many years later, his granddaughter would inherit the candle shop. And one stormy night, in a moment of curiosity, she would find the candle, and she would strike a match. And in the darkness, the flame would flicker once more. The bridge had no name. It appeared in no maps, no records, no history books. Yet those who had crossed it were never seen again. No one knew where it led. No one ever came back to tell. But still, on certain nights, beneath the glow of the moon, the bridge would appear, waiting. And those who set foot upon it would find themselves walking toward a place no one could ever return from. The town of Bracken Hollow had stood for over 200 years, tucked away in the deep forests of Blackthorn County. A quiet town, a safe town, except for one thing. The bridge. Everyone in town knew about it, but no one spoke of it aloud. It was forbidden. Parents warned their children, never go near the bridge. Old men muttered in hushed tones, the bridge takes those who cross it. And every few years, someone would disappear. A traveler, a lost wanderer, sometimes even one of their own. And the bridge would vanish with them, leaving nothing behind. No footprints, no signs, just empty space, as if the bridge had never existed at all. Nathan Carter never believed in ghost stories. He was 19, restless, tired of small-town superstitions. To him, the bridge was just that, a story, something made up to scare kids and keep them from wandering too far. So when his friends dared him to cross the bridge, he didn't hesitate. "You really think a bridge can just disappear?" he scoffed. "Fine, I'll cross it, I'll come back, and I'll prove you all wrong." They met at midnight, just outside the woods where the river ran black under the moonlight. And there it was, the bridge. It hadn't been there before. It was old, wooden, covered in moss, the planks worn down by centuries of wind and rain. Nathan took a deep breath, gave his friends a smirk, and stepped onto the bridge. One step, two. The wood creaked beneath his feet. 10 steps. The air felt strange, thicker, heavier. 20 steps. His friends were still there, watching him from the other side. 30 steps. The air turned cold. And then, the last step. He reached the other side. He turned back to call to his friends. But they were gone. So was the bridge. So was the town. Everything he had known had vanished, and in its place was something else. Nathan stood on the edge of nothingness. Behind him, just trees. Ahead, an endless road stretching into mist and shadows. There was no way back. The bridge had disappeared, just like the stories had said. But where was he? He started walking. The road twisted and turned, the mist growing thicker with every step. And then he saw them, figures in the fog, dozens of them. They stood still, watching him with hollow eyes, their faces pale, their clothes from another time. Some wore old-fashioned suits, others tattered dresses, their expressions blank, empty. Nathan's heart pounded. "Who are you?" he whispered. One of them stepped forward, a young girl. Her dress was torn, her eyes deep wells of darkness. "You crossed the bridge," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Now you are one of us." Nathan ran. He didn't know where he was going, but he had to get away. The road twisted, the air grew colder. The sky above was a deep, endless gray. Then through the mist, he saw buildings, an old town, frozen in time. Gas lamps flickered with ghostly light, casting shadows on cobblestone streets. Signs hung over empty storefronts. Names he didn't recognize, written in an old script. And the people, they were everywhere, silent, watching. Nathan stopped. He saw their faces clearly now. He recognized some of them. People who had vanished from his town, a man who went missing in 1892, a woman who disappeared in 1935, a boy who had crossed the bridge in 1977. They were all here, trapped. "What is this place?" Nathan breathed. An old man, dressed in Victorian-era clothing, stepped forward. "This is Bracken Hollow," he said. "But Bracken Hollow is back home," Nathan argued. The man gave a slow, sorrowful nod. "No, son. This is the other Bracken Hollow, the one on the other side of the bridge." Nathan felt his stomach drop. "You mean there are two towns?" The old man sighed. "Not quite. There is only one Bracken Hollow at a time. One in your world and one in this world. And when someone crosses the bridge, the town switches places." Nathan's blood ran cold. "Then that means—" The man gave a solemn nod. "Bracken Hollow is gone now. And you are here forever." Nathan refused to accept it. There had to be a way back. There had to be a way to break the cycle. But no matter how many times he searched for the bridge, it never returned. The town remained silent, frozen in time, waiting for the next traveler, waiting for the next soul to be claimed. And so Nathan became like the rest, a figure in the mist, a shadow in the forgotten town, watching, waiting, until one day, years later, a new group of travelers stumbled into the town. A boy, barely 18, fearless like Nathan once was. And when he asked about the bridge, Nathan simply shook his head. "Turn back," he whispered, "before it's too late." But the boy did not listen. He stepped onto the bridge, and just like before, Bracken Hollow switched places once more, and Nathan Carter was finally free. Only no one ever saw him again, because when you leave the town, you vanish, just like the bridge, and the cycle begins again. Deep within the heart of Blackvale Forest, where the trees grew twisted and the night seemed eternal, there was a flower that no sunlight had ever touched. It was called the Midnight Rose. No one knew who had first discovered it, only that the legend had existed for centuries. A flower that bloomed only in darkness. A flower said to grant wishes, but only to those willing to pay the price. And the price was always steep. In the quiet village of Eldon Hollow, nestled at the edge of Blackvale Forest, few dared to speak of the Midnight Rose. It was said that those who searched for it never returned. "The forest is cursed," the elders warned. "No light touches that place, and no man should step foot there." But legends, no matter how frightening, always had a way of drawing the desperate. And no one was more desperate than Elias Graymore. Elias had once been the wealthiest man in Eldon Hollow, a merchant, a trader, a man whose fortunes knew no end. But fate had turned against him. A fire had destroyed his business. A thief had taken his remaining gold. His once loyal friends had abandoned him, and his beloved wife, Helena, lay on her deathbed, wasting away from an illness no doctor could cure. Elias would have given anything, everything to save her. And so, when he overheard the whispers of the Midnight Rose, he knew what he had to do. Armed with nothing but a lantern and a dagger, Elias entered Blackvale Forest. The villagers begged him not to go. "The forest will take you," they said. "Nothing human walks there." But Elias ignored their warnings. For 3 days and 3 nights, He wandered through shadows deeper than night itself. His lantern burned low, but the darkness never lessened. He saw things in the trees, whispers of voices, eyes glinting in the blackness. But he pressed on, and then, on the fourth night, he found it, in the heart of the forest, where no stars shone, where no light had ever touched. There it was, a single rose, its petals the color of the deepest midnight, its stem tangled with thorns as sharp as razors. It pulsed with an unnatural glow, as if it were breathing. Ilias stepped closer, his heart pounding. "They say the midnight rose grants a wish," he whispered. "If I take it, will it save her?" The air around him shifted. A voice, low and ancient, whispered through the darkness. "All things have a price." Elias hesitated. "What price?" But the voice did not answer. Taking a deep breath, he reached out and plucked the rose. The moment he did, the forest screamed, the trees twisted, the ground shook, and Elias felt something cold wrap around his soul. But he did not stop. He turned and ran. By the time Elias returned to Eldon Hollow, his wife was moments from death. She lay pale and motionless, her breath coming in shallow gasps. With shaking hands, Elias placed the midnight rose on her chest. "I wish for her to live," he whispered. The rose withered to ash. And then Helena's eyes opened. Her breath came back in a rush, her skin flushed with life once more. She was healed. The midnight rose had kept its promise, but the forest's price had yet to be paid. At first, everything seemed perfect. Helena was alive. Elias had his love back. But then, the shadows came. At night, Elias would wake to whispers in the dark, footsteps in the halls, a feeling that something was watching, and when he looked in the mirror, his reflection was no longer his own. His eyes had changed. They had turned the same deep black as the midnight rose, and every night, the darkness grew closer. One evening, Helena found Elias standing in the garden, staring at the sky. "Elias," she called. He did not respond. She stepped closer and gasped. His shadow was missing, and in its place, a twisting mass of darkness writhed at his feet. Helena screamed, but it was too late. The price had come to collect. Elias turned toward her, his face still, his eyes empty voids. "It took my soul," he whispered. "The rose saved you, but it cursed me." And then he was gone. A gust of wind blew through the garden, carrying nothing but the whisper of a debt repaid. Elias Graymore. Lost to the darkness forever. Helena searched for him, but he was never found. Some said the forest had taken him, swallowed him whole. Others believed he had become something else, something that now lurked in the darkness, waiting for the next desperate soul to seek the rose. But the villagers knew one thing. The midnight rose still bloomed, deep within Blackvale Forest, waiting. And sometimes on the darkest nights, when the moon was hidden and the wind whispered through the trees, a single voice could be heard, carried through the shadows. All things have a price. It started with an antique shop. Daniel had never been one for old things, but his fiancée, Claire, had a fascination with them. They had recently moved into a new home, a charming but slightly run-down Victorian house at the edge of town, and she wanted to fill it with character. So one rainy afternoon, she had dragged him into Whitmore Antiques, a dusty, dimly lit store crammed with relics from bygone eras. Daniel meandered through the aisles, barely paying attention, until something caught his eye. An old mirror, no larger than a standard picture frame, resting against a wooden cabinet. Its surface was fogged with age, the silver backing slightly tarnished, but something about it made him pause. It wasn't quite a mirror, it was glass, thick, slightly warped, and framed in dark, weathered wood. Yet when he tilted it, The reflection moved differently. Instead of mirroring his movements perfectly, there was a tiny lag, a barely perceptible delay. Curious, he picked it up and looked at the back. The wood had intricate carvings, tiny symbols running along the edges, like some ancient language. There was no manufacturer's mark. See something you like? The shopkeeper, an older man with sharp eyes, suddenly appeared at Daniel's side. This is a mirror, right? Daniel asked. The shopkeeper hesitated, then gave a thin smile. Not exactly, it's a looking glass. Daniel frowned. What's the difference? Mirrors reflect what's in front of them, the man said. Looking glasses reflect what's behind. Daniel smirked, assuming it was just some sales pitch. Claire, however, loved the idea. She insisted they take it home, and so they did. They placed the glass in the hallway near the entrance. It was small enough to fit between two framed pictures, and Daniel found himself glancing at it absent-mindedly whenever he walked past. At first, it was unremarkable, but then, small, unsettling things began happening. One night, as he walked down the hall, he glanced at the glass and saw movement behind him. He turned quickly. Nothing. Just the empty hallway leading to the darkened living room. The next day, while getting ready for work, he adjusted his tie in the reflection. Behind him, Claire was brushing her hair. But when he turned to say something to her, she wasn't there. He felt a chill run down his spine. Maybe it was just an illusion, an effect of the warped glass. He didn't tell Claire. Over the next few days, the visions in the glass became more distinct. Shadows, shapes, flickers of movement where there should be none. One evening, Daniel stood before it, staring, testing it. He moved side to side, observing how the reflection lagged just a little, how things in the background seemed just slightly off. And then he saw it, a tall, gaunt figure standing at the end of the hall. Heart pounding, he spun around. Nothing. But when he looked back into the glass, the figure was closer. Daniel stumbled backward, gasping. His breath came ragged, his skin cold with sweat. He yanked the glass from the wall, turned it around, just old wooden nails. Claire found him a few moments later, standing there pale and shaking. "What's wrong?" she asked. He hesitated. If he told her, she'd laugh. Say it was his imagination. "Nothing," he muttered. "Just thought I saw something." She shrugged and went to bed. Daniel didn't sleep. The next night, Daniel decided to test the glass again. This time, he set up his phone to record. He positioned it facing the looking glass, then left the room. He let the camera run for an hour. When he checked the footage, at first it seemed normal, just an empty hallway. But then, at the 45-minute mark, the image flickered. A shape, a figure. It stepped into frame. Tall, skeletal, its limbs unnaturally long. It had no eyes, just hollow, gaping sockets. It loomed in the background, motionless, watching. Then slowly, it began to move. Not forward, upper. It crawled up the walls, its movements jerky, unnatural. Daniel's hands shook as he watched. The thing reached the ceiling, clinging like a spider, its eyeless face turning toward the camera. And then, it snapped its head toward the lens as if it knew it was being watched. Daniel dropped the phone. A sound creaked from the hallway. Slow, deliberate, footsteps right behind him. He turned. Nothing there. The house was silent. But when he looked back at the phone screen, the recording continued, and the figure was right behind him. Daniel wanted to get rid of the glass. He tried throwing it away, but no matter where he put it, outside in the trash, it always reappeared on the wall. Claire noticed his anxiety but brushed it off as stress. Then one night, she woke up screaming. Daniel rushed to her side. "I saw it," she whispered, trembling. "In the glass." The thing was watching them both now. They had to destroy it. Daniel grabbed the glass and carried it outside. He smashed it with a hammer, once, twice, until the wood frame splintered, until the glass cracked into 1,000 shards. And then, silence. Relief. For the first time in weeks, Daniel slept soundly. The next morning, Claire left for work first. Daniel stayed behind, cleaning up the last of the broken pieces. He picked up the largest shard, staring into it. It was just a piece of glass. Nothing strange, nothing lurking. He exhaled, laughing at himself. Maybe it really had all been in his head. He tossed the shard into the trash and turned away. And as he did, the reflection remained, standing, watching, smiling. The end. In the remote countryside of Blackwood Hollow, where thick forests stretched for miles and the air always carried the scent of damp earth, there stood a peculiar tree. It was unlike any other in the dense woodland. Its bark was smooth and pale, almost silver in the moonlight. Its branches stretched high, but its leaves were sparse, casting almost no shade. More unsettling, however, was the fact that no shadow, whether from a passing cloud, a person, or even the tree itself, ever touched the ground beneath it. The villagers called it the hollow tree. No one planted it. No one knew how long it had been there. But they knew one thing for certain: no matter how bright the sun shone or how dim the moonlight fell, the earth beneath it remained untouched by darkness. And that, they whispered, meant something unnatural. Ethan Carter had never believed in local superstitions. A city boy at heart, he had moved to Blackwood Hollow to escape the noise of modern life, trading his tiny apartment for an old cottage near the forest. The townsfolk were kind but wary of him. They saw him as an outsider, someone who didn't understand the land and its secrets. "You best leave that tree alone," warned Mrs. Henshaw, the elderly woman who ran the local grocer. "Nothing good comes from curiosity." Ethan had scoffed. "It's just a tree." Mrs. Henshaw leaned in, lowering her voice. "Aye, just a tree. Just like the ocean is just water. Just like fire is just warm. That tree's been here longer than any of us, and it don't behave like it should." Ethan dismissed the warning with a polite nod, but as he left the store, he couldn't shake the weight of her words. That evening, curiosity got the best of him. The hollow tree was only a short walk from his cottage. As he stepped through the underbrush, he found it exactly as the villagers had described. It loomed before him, silent and still, its presence commanding the clearing like a sentinel. The late afternoon sun poured through the trees, casting long, dark streaks across the forest floor. Everywhere, except beneath the hollow tree. Ethan stepped closer, inspecting the ground. It wasn't just shadowless, it was eerily pristine, as if nothing had ever disturbed it. No fallen leaves, no twigs, not even a single blade of grass. He hesitated before stretching out his hand, letting his own shadow drift forward. But the moment it reached the tree's boundary, it vanished. Ethan pulled his hand back sharply. His shadow reappeared, perfectly intact. He tested it again. The same thing happened. The hollow tree didn't just repel darkness, it devoured it. A chill ran through him. Suddenly the air felt heavier, charged with something unseen. The wind, which had been rustling through the trees a moment ago, died completely. The forest fell into absolute silence. And then, a whisper. Not words, not quite, but a low, hollow sound, like wind moving through an empty house. It came from the tree. Ethan took a step back. The whispering grew louder. He turned and walked away, but the whisper followed. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying what had happened. Maybe it was the wind. Maybe it was just his imagination. At 2:37 a.m., he gave up trying to sleep. Grabbing a flashlight, he stepped out of his cottage and made his way back to the hollow tree. The forest was different at night. The shadows between the trees looked deeper, like open doorways leading to places he didn't want to go. When he reached the clearing, he felt his breath hitch. The hollow tree stood before him, looking unchanged, except now, in the artificial glow of his flashlight, he noticed something etched into its bark. A face. No, not just one. Many. Hundreds of hollow-eyed, screaming faces, their mouths twisted in silent agony, emerging from the wood like trapped souls. Ethan staggered back, his heart pounding. He had touched that bark earlier. How had he not seen this? His flashlight flickered, and the whispering returned. This time, it was everywhere. The trees, the wind, the ground beneath him, then directly behind him. Leave! Ethan spun around, gasping. No one was there, but the hollow tree's branches, they were moving, reaching. The darkness around him deepened, but beneath the tree, the ground remained untouched by shadow, as if it refused to let the darkness in. Or worse, as if it had already claimed it all. Ethan ran. The next morning, he returned to town, pale and shaken. He demanded answers, but the villagers only looked at him with a mix of pity and fear. Finally, old Mrs. Henshaw sighed. "You saw them, didn't you?" "The faces," Ethan whispered. "In the bark." She nodded grimly. "That tree doesn't cast shadows because it's already full of them." She pulled out a faded newspaper clipping, yellowed with age. The headline read, "12 vanish in Blackwood Hollow. Only footprints remain." "People go missing in those woods," she said. "Always near that tree. Always without a trace. Some say it doesn't just steal shadows, it steals souls." Ethan felt ice settle in his chest. "But why?" he asked. Mrs. Henshaw's eyes darkened. "Because it's hungry." That night, Ethan made his decision. He needed to destroy it. Armed with an axe and gasoline, he returned to the hollow tree. The air was thick, humming with an unnatural stillness. He swung the axe. The blade barely made a dent, but from the wound, something black oozed out. Not sap, something alive. The whispering turned into a roar. The ground trembled. Then hands burst from the earth. Not hands, shadows. They clutched at his legs, pulling him down. He swung wildly, but his strikes passed through them. The faces in the bark twisted, their mouths opening in silent, endless screams. The hollow tree had waited long enough. It had found a new shadow to take. Days later, hikers found Ethan's abandoned axe near the hollow tree. But of Ethan himself, there was no sign. The villagers knew better than to ask questions. He was gone, swallowed like the others. And the hollow tree remained, still standing, still untouched by shadow, still waiting. The end. James Holloway never expected to inherit anything from his estranged great-uncle Edward. Their family had long whispered about the old man, an eccentric recluse who had spent decades alone in a decaying Victorian manor on Blackwood Lane. But when Edward passed, the deed to the estate found its way into James's hands. The house was massive, with towering gables and ivy-choked walls. Inside, dust coated every surface, and the scent of old books and rotting wood hung in the air. He hadn't planned to stay long, just long enough to assess its value and put it on the market. But then he found the window. It was in the study, a grand room with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and a massive oak desk. Unlike the other windows in the house, this one wasn't dusty or fogged over. Its glass was strangely pristine, reflecting the afternoon light with unnatural clarity. At first, James thought nothing of it, but when he glanced outside, his breath caught in his throat. Instead of the overgrown garden and rusted iron fence he had passed earlier, the window showed a pristine lawn. A beautiful rose garden stretched toward a white stone pathway, and beyond that, a woman in an elegant, old-fashioned dress, walking arm in arm with a man in a waistcoat. James blinked. The scene was too vivid, too detailed, like a movie playing before his eyes. But there was no screen, No projector, just the window. And then suddenly the woman turned and looked directly at him. James stumbled backward, his pulse racing. He looked behind him, scanning the room. No camera, no trick glass, just an old window pane set in its wooden frame. When he turned back, the scene had changed. The sun was lower now, casting long shadows across the garden. The couple was gone. James pressed a hand to the glass. It was cold, solid, just like any ordinary window. But it wasn't. That night, curiosity gnawed at him. He returned to the study, flicking on a lamp. Outside, through the window, the scene had shifted again. The once beautiful garden was now overgrown, its roses wilted. The stone path was cracked, and in the distance, a figure stood at the edge of the frame, barely visible in the twilight. Watching. A chill ran down James's spine. He yanked the curtain shut. Determined to find an explanation, James searched the house for answers. He started in the attic, where trunks of old belongings lay untouched for decades. In one, he found a diary. The leather-bound book belonged to his great-uncle Edward. Flipping through the brittle pages, James skimmed years of mundane entries, until one passage caught his eye. March 12th, 1926. I have discovered something remarkable. The window in my study is not like the others. It shows me things that should not be. A world outside of time. At first I believed it to be an illusion, a trick of the mind. But I have seen people in it who have been dead for decades, and they have seen me. James's stomach tightened. He turned the page. April 8th, 1926. The woman in the garden, her name is Eleanor. She once lived in this house long before my time. She was murdered here, her body never found. She watches me through the glass now, waiting. I fear that if I look too long, I will become part of what she sees. James slammed the book shut. He had seen Eleanor, and she had seen him. The next night, James sat in the study, drawn to the window despite his fear. The scene had shifted again. Now it showed the house itself, but not as it was now. The paint was fresh, the lights inside warm and golden. A party was taking place. Men in suits and women in flapper dresses sipped champagne. Music drifted through the open doors. James felt a strange pull, as if the window was more than just a barrier, as if it was a door. And then he saw Eleanor. She stood on the balcony, her expression unreadable. Slowly, she lifted a hand and beckoned. James's breath caught. His fingers twitched toward the glass. The whispers began, soft at first like wind through leaves, then louder, clearer. "Help me." James jerked back, heart pounding. The scene in the window flickered, changed. The party was gone. The house was dark. The garden was empty. And Eleanor was standing right on the other side of the glass. James spent the next day in the town archives, searching for any record of Eleanor. He found her, Eleanor Whitmore, a young socialite who had lived in the house in the late 1800s. She had vanished on the night of a grand party in 1892. No body was ever found. Rumors swirled. Some claimed she had eloped. Others whispered of murder. James's hands trembled as he read. Had his great-uncle seen all of this through the window? Had Eleanor tried to reach him too? James returned to the house, more determined than ever. That night, he stood before the window and spoke. "Eleanor, if you can hear me, show me what happened." The glass rippled, and then the past unfolded before him. James watched as the grand party played out once more, but now he saw what the others had not. A man, tall, dressed in a sharp black suit, led Eleanor through the garden. He whispered something in her ear. She stiffened. Then he grabbed her. Eleanor struggled, but he was too strong. He dragged her toward the edge of the garden, where a freshly dug hole waited. James's stomach churned. He was watching her murder. The man forced her to the ground. There was a glint of metal, a flash of movement. Then, Eleanor was gone. The man shoveled dirt over the hole, his expression cold and unreadable. James knew then. Eleanor had never left the house. She had been buried there, beneath the roses. And the window had kept her story alive. The next morning, James contacted the authorities. He led them to the garden, to the exact spot. It took hours of digging, but finally they found her, a skeleton wrapped in what remained of a delicate lace gown. The newspapers called it the Whitmore mystery solved after over a century. But James knew the truth. It wasn't just history that had spoken, it was Eleanor. That night he stood before the window one last time. The scene was different now. The garden was empty, the house was still, and Eleanor, she was gone. James smiled faintly. For the first time since he had arrived, the window showed nothing but the present. And for the first time in over 100 years, Eleanor was free. Nathan Carter had always loved strange places. As a journalist for Mysteries Uncovered, he had traveled to haunted hotels, towns with unsolved disappearances, and villages where no one dared to speak after sunset. But nothing intrigued him quite like the rumors about Ravenshade, a secluded town where clocks moved backward and time itself refused to behave. According to scattered reports, no one knew exactly when Ravenshade had been founded. There were no birth or death records, and people who left the town were never seen again. Those who stayed claimed to age in reverse. Gray-haired elders became youthful, children grew smaller, and newborns eventually disappeared. Nathan had to see it for himself. With his camera, notebook, and a map that barely marked the town's location, he drove deep into the mountains of Vermont. The winding roads grew narrower, the trees denser. His phone lost service miles ago. Then, just as he began to think he had taken a wrong turn, he saw it, a weathered wooden sign covered in creeping ivy. "Welcome to Ravenshade." As Nathan drove through the town's entrance, an eerie stillness settled over him. The air felt thicker, as if time itself had a weight. Ravenshade looked like something out of an old photograph. The buildings were mostly Victorian-style homes with peeling paint and rusted iron fences. The streets were quiet, too quiet. No honking cars, no distant chatter. Then he saw the clock tower. It loomed over the town square, its massive hands moving counterclockwise. The second hand ticked backward, steadily undoing time. Nathan parked his car and stepped out. A young woman in a simple blue dress walked past him, carrying a basket of apples. She looked no older than 20, but her posture, the lines on her hands, they belonged to someone much older. "Excuse me," Nathan called out. "Could you tell me what year it is?" The woman hesitated. "It's Isiona Sibonyan." Then she frowned. "Or maybe it's 2024. Her face twisted in confusion, and she quickly walked away. Nathan's skin prickled. Something was very, very wrong. Determined to learn more, Nathan checked into the Hollow Inn, the only hotel in town. The elderly innkeeper, Mr. Whitmore, greeted him with tired eyes. "You're not from around here," Whitmore said, studying him carefully. "No," Nathan admitted. "I'm a journalist. I came to learn about the town." Whitmore sighed, rubbing his temples. "You should leave before you forget why you came." Nathan frowned. "What do you mean?" Before the old man could answer, the wall clock behind him chimed. Nathan turned to look. The hour hand had just shifted backward, and then so did the people in the room. For a brief moment, Whitmore looked younger. His wrinkles softened, his gray hair darkened at the roots. A woman dusting a nearby shelf stood a little taller, her posture straightening. Nathan's heart pounded. He blinked, and just like that, everything was normal again. "What the hell was that?" Nathan whispered. Whitmore sighed. "Time does not move forward here. It moves backward. Every hour that passes, we become a little younger." Nathan swallowed hard. What happens when someone reaches the beginning? Whitmore's expression darkened. They disappear. Nathan spent the next day exploring the town, taking notes and photographs. He spoke with locals who confirmed what Whitmore had said. A man named Arthur claimed to have been 65 last year. Now he looked no older than 40. A woman named Margaret confessed that she had once been a mother. But my child, she grew younger and younger until she was no more. Nathan's stomach twisted. How could that be possible? And then he met Eleanor. She was sitting on a wooden bench in the town square, reading an old leather-bound book. Unlike the others, she seemed aware of everything happening around her. "You're the journalist, right?" she said, glancing up at him. Nathan nodded. "How do you know?" "I've seen you before," she said. "Many times." Nathan frowned. "What do you mean?" Eleanor sighed. "This town is caught in a loop. You arrived here once before." Nathan's blood ran cold. "That's not possible." Eleanor turned a page in her book. "Do you ever wonder why there are no clocks in your room at the inn?" Nathan felt a wave of nausea. He had noticed that, but hadn't thought much of it. "Because if you saw the time changing while you slept," Eleanor said, "you'd realize the truth." Nathan clenched his jaw. "And what's the truth?" Eleanor's eyes darkened. "You're already forgetting." That night, Nathan struggled to stay awake. His mind raced. Had he really been here before? If so, why couldn't he remember? As the hours passed, a terrifying thought settled in his mind. If time was moving backward for everyone, was it moving backward for him too? He needed proof. He grabbed his camera and took a selfie, snapping the photo under the dim glow of the lamp. Then he forced himself to sleep. Nathan woke to the sound of a bell. The clock tower was ringing. Disoriented, he reached for his camera and opened the photo he had taken. His hands trembled. The man in the picture was older than him. Wrinkles lined his forehead. His hair was streaked with gray. Nathan stumbled to the bathroom mirror. The face staring back at him was younger. He was undoing. Memories flickered at the edge of his mind. Fragments of other visits to Ravenshade, of past versions of himself that had tried to escape and failed. He had to leave. Now Nathan threw his belongings into a bag and ran out of the inn. The sky was darker than before. The town looked older, as if it had regressed decades overnight. He sprinted to his car, but when he reached it, it was different. The once modern vehicle was now a rusted husk, its tires flat, its windshield cracked with age, as if it had been sitting there for years. "No," Nathan whispered, stepping back. A voice behind him. "You can't leave." He turned. Eleanor. Her face was younger than yesterday. "You've tried before," she said softly. "Every time you forget. Every time you start over." Nathan shook his head. "I won't let it happen again." Eleanor's expression was pained. "You say that every time." The clock tower rang again. Nathan's vision blurred. His thoughts scattered. The town around him faded. His memories dissolved. And then he arrived, a journalist, curious about the town where clocks move backward, just like the first time, just like every time. It was said that the violin had once belonged to Alessandro Vittori, a virtuoso whose music could bring even the most hardened souls to tears. His final performance was never finished. As he played the last note of his masterpiece, a sound so mournful that birds fell silent, he collapsed on stage, dead before his body hit the floor. The violin remained perfectly intact, its strings still humming with the last note he had played. And from that day forward, it was cursed. For wherever the violin went, it played on its own. And those who heard its song never heard anything again. Lillian Carter never believed in curses. As an antique collector, she had spent years acquiring rare artifacts, always searching for something unique. When she received an invitation to a private auction, promising a collection of lost musical instruments, she didn't hesitate. The auction house was old, its walls lined with relics from forgotten composers. But one piece stood apart from the rest. A violin, dark polished wood, with intricate carvings of weeping angels along its body. No price was listed, no information given, only a single note attached. Once played, never silenced. Something about it sent a chill down her spine, and yet she had to have it. That night, Lillian placed the violin in her study. She ran her fingers over the smooth wood, admiring its craftsmanship. But when she plucked at the strings, they were already tuned. Her heart pounded. No one had played this violin in years. So how? Then the bow moved, on its own. It glided across the strings in a slow, mournful wail, a song aching with sorrow. The air around her grew thick, heavy with an unseen presence. And as the melody filled the room, a shadow flickered in the corner. Watching, listening, the violin was playing for someone who wasn't there, or perhaps someone who was. Lillian tried to ignore the strange occurrences, but the violin would not let her. Every night as the clock struck midnight, it began to play, always the same melancholy tune. No matter where she hid it, a locked case, a sealed vault, even beneath the floorboards, the sound would always return. It wasn't just a violin, it was a voice, and it was mourning something, or someone. One night, desperate for answers, Lillian played along with it. As her bow met the strings, something shifted in the air. A whisper, a breath against her ear. "You hear us now." The lights flickered, the room grew cold, and when she looked up, she was not alone. The spirits came with the music. They stood in the corners of her home, silent, weeping, pale faces, eyes hollow with sorrow. She recognized some of them, people who had vanished, musicians, listeners, collectors, anyone who had ever heard the violin song. They did not speak, but when the violin played, their mouths moved, crying, begging. Lillian realized the truth too late. The violin did not just play for the dead, it created them. Lillian stopped sleeping. The music haunted her every hour. She tried destroying the violin. Fire, water, a hammer to its wooden frame. Nothing worked. It refused to break. And the more she tried, the louder it played. She became a prisoner in her own home. Her reflection in the mirror grew thinner, her eyes sunken. She knew what would happen next. The violin had chosen her, just as it had chosen Alessandro Vittori. The only way to silence it was to play its final song. So with trembling hands, she lifted the bow. The violin hummed in anticipation, and she played. The final note hung in the air, a sound so sorrowful that the walls shook. And then, silence. Lillian Carter was never seen again. Her home was found abandoned, a thin layer of dust covering everything. Only one thing remained untouched, the violin, waiting for its next player, for the next soul to mourn, for the next name to be added to the song. The house stood at the end of Willow Lane, surrounded by an overgrown hedge and a wrought iron gate that never seemed to rust. It was old but untouched by time, its dark stone walls standing firm against the years. No one knew who built it, no one knew who owned it, but everyone in town knew one thing. No one stayed inside for long. When Eleanor Graves arrived in town, she didn't believe in ghost stories. She had spent years traveling from place to place, always searching for something permanent. So when she saw the house on Willow Lane, with its arched doorways and ivy-covered walls, she felt something she hadn't in a long time. She felt at home. The landlord, a man whose name she immediately forgot, gave her a single warning as he handed her the key. "Don't be afraid when the house moves." She had laughed then, but that night she would learn the truth. The house was perfectly normal during the day, A grand foyer with a sweeping staircase, a study lined with dusty books, a cozy bedroom overlooking the garden. She went to sleep comfortably, wrapped in warm blankets, the old wooden beams creaking softly in the wind. But when she woke, the door was missing. The walls were different. The bedroom had become a hallway stretching into the darkness. She scrambled out of bed, her breath coming in short gasps. The floorboards beneath her feet shifted. The house had changed, and she was trapped inside it. At first, she thought she was dreaming. Maybe the house was just old, the corridors twisting in her tired mind. But when she opened a door, expecting the foyer, she found herself in a kitchen she had never seen before. A room with a cracked marble floor and a single chair, pulled out as if someone had just been sitting there. Another door led her to a library, though she remembered the study being downstairs. The books here were wrong, their pages blank, their spines unmarked. And when she tried to retrace her steps, she couldn't. The house had rewritten itself, like a maze with no exit. By the third night, Eleanor had given up trying to map the house. Every evening, the rooms shifted, doors vanished, walls stretched into corridors she swore hadn't existed before. But worst of all, she was no longer alone. She heard them at night, whispers, coming from rooms that shouldn't have been there, soft voices, speaking words she couldn't understand. Somewhere in the distance, a door creaked open. Footsteps echoed in a hallway she hadn't seen before. And when she turned around, the furniture had moved, chairs facing her, as if watching. On the seventh night, she found the door. It stood alone at the end of a hallway that hadn't been there the night before. It was different from the others. Older. The wood was cracked, the handle cold beneath her fingertips. Something inside her screamed not to open it, but she did. And what she saw shouldn't have been possible. It was a room of doors, hundreds of them, stretching into the darkness. Each door identical, standing in neat rows, and in front of each one, a figure, not moving, not breathing, just standing, silent, waiting. Her stomach turned, her breath caught. She stepped back, and the door slammed shut behind her. The whispers rose, the house shifted, and Eleanor ran. She stopped counting the days. She no longer knew where she was. The house changed faster now, its hallways twisting like living veins. Sometimes she found old furniture covered in dust. Other times, she opened a door to find nothing but a brick wall. Once, she opened a door and saw herself, standing in a hallway she hadn't walked through yet. A shadow passed behind her reflection. She slammed the door shut before she could see what it was. Eleanor knew she had to leave. She could feel it. The house was growing restless. It was tired of her, or maybe it wanted to keep her forever. She had one chance, one final attempt to escape. That night when the house moved, she ran. She didn't think. She didn't stop. She sprinted through shifting hallways, down twisting staircases, through doorways that melted into new rooms before her eyes. Somewhere behind her, the whisper screamed. The floor tilted. The walls collapsed inward. And then, she saw it. The front door, still standing, still waiting. She didn't look back. She didn't dare. She reached for the handle, and the house roared. Wind rushed past her, pulling at her clothes, yanking her back. But she would not stay. With every ounce of strength she had left, she forced the door open and fell into the night. They found Eleanor the next morning, lying in the street, eyes wide, breathing shallow. She never spoke of what she had seen. She never returned to Willow Lane. The house stood empty again, waiting. And 2 months later, a new tenant arrived, a man who did not believe in ghost stories. He took the key, stepped inside, and that night, the house changed again. The Langley estate had been empty for decades, its windows dark, its halls silent. The townsfolk whispered about the curse, a tragedy that had seeped into the very walls of the house. They said anyone who entered would hear the ticking, and once the pendulum clock began its countdown, it would never stop until despair consumed its owner. Most ignored the rumors, but then Julian Grayson bought the house, and the clock began ticking once more. Julian had never believed in ghost stories. A historian by trade, he had spent his career unraveling myths, exposing the rational truth behind folklore. So when he inherited the Langley estate from a distant relative, he saw an opportunity, a grand old house to restore, perhaps even turn into a museum. The first time he set foot in the study, he noticed it immediately. A massive pendulum clock standing against the far wall. Its wood was dark and polished, its brass pendulum gleaming despite the dust that coated everything else in the room. The hands rested at midnight, and the pendulum was still. Something about it made his skin crawl. Yet when he reached out, the clock ticked. Julian hadn't wound the clock, but that night he woke to the sound of ticking. He turned on the light, heart pounding, and listened. Tick, tick, tick. He followed the sound to the study, the air growing colder with each step. The clock's hands had moved. It now read 11:59 p.m. The pendulum swung, slow and deliberate, counting down. The next morning he tried to stop the clock. He removed the weights. He blocked the pendulum. He even tried removing the hands from the face. None of it worked. No matter what he did, the clock continued counting down. And then, Julian realized something was wrong with time. At first it was subtle. A book left open moved to a different page when he looked away. A candle burned down too fast, as if hours had passed instead of minutes. Then one evening, as he watched the clock, it skipped. One moment it read 10:43 p.m. The next, 10:32 p.m. Time was moving backward, and it was taking something from him. Julian began hearing voices. At first it was just murmurs, the kind of noise an old house might make when settling at night. But soon the whispers became words. Why did you let it take me? He should have stopped the clock. It's too late now. He started seeing things. Figures standing in doorways, shadows moving across the study, and always the ticking continued, counting down. Tick, tick, tick. Determined to end the madness, Julian researched the house's history. He discovered that the Langley family had all met the same fate, not by disease, not by accident, but by despair. Each owner of the house had been consumed by grief that came from nowhere, that deepened into madness, that eventually led them to end their own lives. And the one thing they all had in common was the clock. It counted down, and when it reached zero, its owner would be lost to despair. Forever. Julian tried to escape. He packed his bags, threw open the front door, and found nothing. The world beyond the estate was gone. Only fog stretched beyond the threshold, thick and endless. The house wouldn't let him leave. His only chance was to stop the clock. Julian smashed the glass casing. The pendulum kept swinging. He threw the clock down, shattering its frame. The gears kept turning. He burned what was left. The clock kept ticking. And then the clock struck midnight. A final heavy chime echoed through the estate, and Julian felt it. The weight of every sorrow he had ever known. Memories that weren't his own. Pain, loss, regret, cascaded over him in a wave of utter hopelessness. It was over. He understood now. The clock didn't kill its victims. It simply made them see the truth. That life was nothing but despair. That time was a curse. That there was only one way out. Julian reached for the razor on the desk. His hands trembled. The house was silent, waiting. Then, a knock at the door. The house stood dark and quiet once more. The study was empty, save for the clock. standing tall and untouched. Its hands were still. For now. Outside, a man in a black suit adjusted his tie. The real estate agent handed him a set of keys. "The Langley estate is all yours, Mr. Carter." The man smiled. And inside the house, the clock began to tick again. There was a door in Blackwood Manor that no key could open. It stood at the end of the third-floor hallway, framed in dark oak, its brass handle polished but motionless. No one had ever passed through it. No one had ever seen what lay beyond it. And no one, no matter how many keys they tried, had ever been able to unlock it. Some said the door led to a forgotten room. Others whispered that whatever lay beyond was never meant to be found. But one thing was certain. The door was waiting, and one day someone would try to open it. Daniel Holloway hadn't expected much from his late uncle's estate. The old man had been a recluse, living alone in Blackwood Manor for the last 30 years. When Daniel arrived to claim his inheritance, he found the house in a state of eerie preservation, as if someone had been expecting him. The furniture was still covered in white sheets. The air was heavy with the scent of dust and time. And then there was the door. At first, he barely noticed it. Just another fixture in a house full of strange, antique beauty. But as the days passed, his eyes kept drifting to the end of the third-floor hallway, to the door. It was different from the others. It had no keyhole, no visible lock, and yet no matter how hard he pushed, pulled, or pried, it would not budge. His uncle had left behind journals, old and yellowed, their ink smudged in places. Daniel flipped through them, searching for anything about the door. Then one night, he found a single entry that made his breath catch. "The door is not to be opened. Not by a key, nor by force, nor by will. It waits. It chooses. And when it is ready, it will open on its own." The house was not empty, not entirely. At night, when Daniel lay in bed, he would hear it. A faint, rhythmic sound. A tapping, soft, deliberate, coming from behind the door. At first, he convinced himself it was the house settling. But then, the whispers started. He never heard full words, only fragments. "Help me! Trapped! Not safe!" Yet when he pressed his ear against the wood, the whispers stopped. He tried calling out, "Who's there?" Silence. But the tapping continued. And when he woke the next morning, he found the doorknob warm to the touch, as if someone had been holding it. The study was filled with relics of the past. Dusty books, faded paintings, and one peculiar portrait that hung above the fireplace. It depicted a man in his late 40s, dressed in an old-fashioned black suit. Daniel didn't recognize him, but something about the eyes unsettled him. The man in the painting was staring, not straight ahead as most portraits did, but at the door, as if watching it, as if waiting. That night, the whispers grew louder. The tapping turned into a slow, deliberate knock, and Daniel, against every instinct in his body, reached for the doorknob. This time it turned, just a little, just enough to make his stomach drop. Something had changed. Something had let him in. The next morning, the door was ajar, not open, just enough of a crack for Daniel to see darkness beyond it. He hesitated. Then, with a deep breath, he pushed it open. What he saw made his skin crawl. It was a room, but not like the rest of the house. The air was stale. The walls were bare stone, as if the room had never been part of the manor at all. And in the center stood a single chair, occupied by a man in a black suit, the same man from the portrait. He didn't move, didn't blink. His eyes were open but lifeless, and around his wrists and ankles were chains, rusted but firm. The whispers returned, but this time they spoke as one. "You should not have come." Daniel stumbled backward, his breath caught in his throat. The man, or whatever remained of him, was watching, not moving, not breathing. just watching. And then the door slammed shut. The room was gone. The man was gone. But the whispers remained. One more. It needed one more. Daniel's blood ran cold. He turned, and there, on the wall above the fireplace, the portrait had changed. The man was gone, and in his place was Daniel, his face frozen in horror, his eyes staring at the door. The whispers grew louder. The tapping began again. And this time, it was coming from inside the room. The house stood empty once more. The portrait remained on the wall, the new face watching, waiting. And at the end of the hallway, the locked door stood still. No key would ever open it. No force could break it, because the door was waiting for the next one to enter. The field stretched for miles, untouched by roads or fences. Wildflowers grew in bursts of color, swaying gently in the breeze, and the grass was always tall, too tall, as if no scythe had ever passed through. But it wasn't the beauty of the field that made travelers turn away. It was the sound, a constant, low murmur, rising and falling like wind over water. No matter the season, no matter the time of day, the whispers never stopped. They came from beneath the earth, from the roots, from something buried long ago. And those who stepped into the field never walked out the same. When Thomas Graves arrived in the village of Briar Hollow, the first thing he heard about was the field. "You'll want to stay away from that place," the innkeeper warned as he handed over a key to his room. "Why?" Thomas asked, setting down his travel bag. The old man hesitated, his fingers tightening around the key. "You ever heard the sound of voices when no one's speaking?" Thomas frowned. "You mean an echo?" "No," the innkeeper muttered. "I mean voices that ain't yours. That ain't anyone's." Thomas didn't believe in folklore. He was a historian, here to research the lost settlements that once dotted the countryside. His work required facts, records, and evidence, not ghost stories. But as he lay in bed that night, listening to the wind howl through the trees, something about the innkeeper's words stayed with him. The next morning, Thomas took the old road east, toward the place the locals refused to go. The field was just as the villagers had described, vast and unbroken, stretching into the distance like a sea of green. And then he heard it, a low whispering hum. At first he thought it was the wind, but the air was still. The trees surrounding the field were motionless, yet the sound continued, rising and falling, words just out of reach. He stepped forward, his boots sinking into the damp earth. The whispers grew louder. Names. They were saying names. He knelt down, pressing his palm to the soil. The ground was warm, and beneath it, something shifted. Thomas spent hours in the field, recording everything. The voices spoke in overlapping murmurs, never distinct enough to form full sentences. He jotted down fragments in his notebook. "They took us. We are still here. The roots remember." The deeper he walked into the field, the more uneasy he became. The grass thickened, twisting around his boots. The whispers rose in urgency. And then he saw it, a stone slab, half buried in the earth. It was weathered, covered in moss, but the engravings were clear enough to read. A single word carved deep into the rock. "Remember." A chill ran down his spine. He wasn't standing in a field. He was standing on a graveyard. Thomas raced back to the village, notebook in hand, demanding answers. The townsfolk refused to speak. Faces turned away. Doors slammed shut. But the old innkeeper, his expression grim, finally relented. "A long time ago," he said, his voice heavy with regret, "there was a settlement out there." "A village?" Thomas asked. The old man shook his head. "A prison." Thomas felt his breath catch. "During the war," the innkeeper continued, "they brought prisoners out here. Said they'd build their own homes, work the land, but they never meant to let them go. They buried them there, Thomas whispered. They let them starve first, the innkeeper corrected. And suddenly the whispers made sense. They weren't ghosts, they were memories, trapped in the soil, bound to the roots, and they wanted to be heard. Thomas returned to the field at sunset, shovel in hand. He had to know. He had to see. As he dug, the voices rose in a fevered chant, no longer whispers but pleas. Stop. Don't disturb us. The land keeps us safe. His shovel hit something hard, a wooden box, its lid cracked. Inside, bones. Not just one set, dozens. A mass grave. The earth beneath him shuddered, and the voices screamed. The wind roared to life, the sky darkening as clouds churned overhead. The roots tightened around his boots, and the last thing Thomas heard before the field swallowed him whole was the sound of the wind whispering his name. Weeks later, a traveler passed through Briar Hollow. At the inn, he asked about the historian who had come through town. The old innkeeper shook his head. Never seen him, he muttered. But the traveler frowned. Someone must have been here. I found this on the road. He held up a notebook, weathered and torn. The innkeeper took it, his hands trembling as he flipped through the pages. And there, on the very last page, was a single sentence, scrawled in frantic handwriting. I hear them now. I hear them beneath me. I hear them calling my name. And from outside, carried on the wind, came the sound of whispers in the grass. The old mirror stood in the forgotten corner of an abandoned estate. Tall and elegant, its silver frame was tarnished with age, its glass unblemished by time. No matter how long it had been left untouched, it never gathered dust. No matter how many years passed, it never cracked. And every morning, as the first rays of dawn touched its surface, it revealed the past. When Eleanor Whitmore received word that she had inherited the Ashford estate, she barely remembered the name. Her great-uncle Silas Ashford had been a reclusive man, living alone in a crumbling mansion far from the city. He had never married, never had children, and yet in his will, he had left everything to her. A house she had never visited, a family she had never known. Curious and more than a little suspicious, Eleanor packed her bags and traveled to Blackwood Hollow, where the estate lay hidden among towering trees and mist-laden hills. The journey took the better part of a day, the roads winding and treacherous. When she finally arrived, the first thing she noticed was the silence. Not a single bird sang, not a single leaf rustled, and the air felt heavy, as if the past still lingered in the very bones of the house. The estate was massive, far too large for one person, filled with dust-covered furniture and unopened rooms. But it was in the grand hall that Eleanor found the mirror. It stood against the far wall, between two towering bookshelves. The glass was perfect, its surface clearer than any mirror she had ever seen. Yet when she looked into it, something felt wrong. Her reflection was there, but behind her, the room was different. Instead of empty shelves, there were books. Instead of a cold, dark fireplace, a fire burned brightly. And there, seated in a chair that should have been covered in dust, was a man. Eleanor spun around. The room behind her was exactly as it should be. Empty, abandoned, lifeless. She turned back to the mirror. The man was still there, staring at her. And then, just as the first sliver of sunlight rose over the horizon, he moved. Eleanor staggered back, her breath catching in her throat. The man in the mirror, his face blurred by time, stood from his chair, walking toward her. The closer he came, the clearer he became. His clothes were from another century, a well-tailored coat and high-collared shirt. His eyes, deep and knowing, locked onto hers. And then he spoke. You shouldn't be here. The whisper of his voice sent shivers down Eleanor's spine. Before she could respond, the first golden rays of the sun broke through the windows. And just like that, the man vanished. The mirror once again showed only her own reflection, as if nothing had happened at all. Eleanor spent the day searching the house, looking for any record of the man she had seen. The library contained books with blank pages. The study held portraits with faces scratched out. The attic was filled with trunks that wouldn't open. It was as if the history of the house had been erased. But as night fell, she found something, a single journal hidden beneath the floorboards of the master bedroom. It belonged to Margaret Ashford, her great-great-grandmother, and the last entry, written in shaking script, chilled Eleanor to her core. The mirror is cursed. It shows what should have been forgotten. The house remembers what we try to erase, and every dawn it brings them back. The next morning, Eleanor stood before the mirror once more. As the first light of dawn touched the glass, the past returned. The grand hall came alive with people, servants, guests, and the man she had seen the night before. She watched as a tragedy long buried unfolded before her. The man, his name she realized was Jonathan Ashford, stood arguing with another figure, his face hidden in shadow. There was shouting, a struggle, a flash of silver, a knife. And then Jonathan fell. His body slumped to the floor, lifeless. The killer knelt beside him, hands shaking. And when the figure finally turned toward the mirror, Eleanor saw her own face. She staggered back. A scream caught in her throat. This couldn't be real. She had never been here before. She had never killed a man. Had she? The mirror flickered, the images shifting like ripples on water. The grand hall faded, and in the glass, Eleanor saw herself once more, but different. Wearing the same clothes as Margaret Ashford, holding the same blood-stained knife, and Jonathan's voice echoed through the room, whispering from beyond time. The past never dies. The mirror never lies. You were here before, Eleanor, and you will be here again. The dawn faded. The past disappeared, and Eleanor was left standing in the empty hall with the weight of a crime she had never committed. Or had she? Eleanor never left Ashford Estate. The town spoke of her as a woman who had lost herself to the past, wandering its halls at dawn, waiting for the mirror to tell her more. Some say she had gone mad, others say she had remembered. But those who dared visit the abandoned mansion, long after Eleanor herself had faded into history, always found the mirror still standing. And every morning, as the first light of dawn touched the glass, a figure appeared inside. Not of Jonathan, not of Margaret, but of Eleanor, staring out from the other side of time, trapped forever.